The internet froze the moment the words leaked out. At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood, the man who built an empire on silence, grit, and restraint, finally said the one thing he'd avoided for decades. And the name at the center of it all sent shockwaves through Hollywood like an aftershock no one saw coming: Rob Reiner. For years, the rumors whispered behind studio doors. The tension, the quiet snubs, the icy comments buried in interviews that most people missed. Fans always suspected something was off, but no one imagined the truth would surface like this. Not now, not from Clint himself, and not with the weight of finality that only a 95-year-old legend can carry. Because this wasn't a casual reflection. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a reckoning. A moment where Clint stopped protecting the myth, stopped playing the Hollywood game, and decided to tell the story the way it actually happened. Insiders say the admission came during a private conversation that was never supposed to leave the room until it did. And once it leaked, there was no putting it back. What Clint revealed didn't just rewrite an old feud. It reframed decades of political clashes, creative power struggles, and personal resentment that quietly shaped modern Hollywood. People thought they knew why Clint and Rob were always on opposite sides. Turns out that was only the surface. Because when Clint finally spoke, he didn't just criticize, he confessed. And what he admitted about Rob Reiner has people rewatching old interviews, reinterpreting old films, and asking one chilling question: how much of this did we get completely wrong? For decades, the story everyone thought they understood was simple. Clint Eastwood, the embodiment of old-school Hollywood discipline, and Rob Reiner, the outspoken director whose voice grew louder with every cultural shift, were just ideological opposites who happened to exist in the same industry. That's the version people repeated at dinner parties, in comment sections, and in lazy headlines. But what Clint finally admitted at 95 years old shattered that neat little narrative in a way no one was prepared for. According to people who were present when the conversation happened, Clint didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something for too long because saying it out loud would have caused more chaos than silence ever did. He reportedly leaned back, paused longer than usual, and said something that immediately reframed everything. The conflict with Rob Reiner was never just about politics. Politics, he implied, was the cover story. The truth was far more personal, far more rooted in Hollywood's invisible power games. Clint admitted that early on, he actually respected Rob. That revelation alone stunned people who have spent years watching the two men lob thinly veiled insults from opposite sides of the cultural battlefield. Clint acknowledged Rob's talent, his instincts, and his ability to read an audience in a way few directors could. But respect, Clint said, doesn't protect you when ambition starts colliding with ego. And that's where things quietly turned. He described a period in Hollywood when lines were being redrawn. Studios were shifting. Voices that once operated behind the camera were suddenly becoming moral authorities in front of it. Clint claimed he watched Rob transition from filmmaker to power broker almost overnight, and that transition came with consequences. Scripts stopped circulating the same way. Meetings felt colder. Invitations quietly disappeared. Nothing blatant, nothing provable, just enough pressure to make a point. What Clint admitted, and what shook listeners the most, was that he chose not to fight it publicly. He said he knew how Hollywood worked. If he called it out, he'd be framed as bitter, outdated, or threatened. So instead, he leaned into silence and let the public assume the divide was purely ideological. That assumption, Clint suggested, benefited everyone except the truth. He recalled moments where he felt deliberately misrepresented, not through direct attacks, but through narrative shaping. Clint said Rob was exceptionally good at framing stories, not just on screen, but in real life. Quotes would circulate stripped of context. Intentions would be inferred rather than explained. And over time, Clint realized he wasn't just disagreeing with Rob, he was being written into a role he never auditioned for. One of the most unsettling admissions was Clint's acknowledgement that he underestimated how permanent those narratives could become. He thought time would soften things. He believed work would speak louder than commentary. Instead, the distance grew. Clint said there were years when people approached him already assuming his stance, his motives, his character, all based on a version of events he never confirmed and never denied. And Clint didn't accuse him of orchestrating some grand conspiracy. In fact, he was careful not to paint Rob as a villain. That restraint made the admission heavier, not lighter. Clint suggested Rob genuinely believed he was on the right side of history, and that belief justified collateral damage. Careers cooled. Relationships fractured. Doors closed quietly, politely, permanently. Clint admitted that the hardest part wasn't losing opportunities. It was watching younger artists absorb the lesson. He said they learned quickly who was safe, who was problematic, and who was better admired from a distance. The labels, Clint implied, weren't organic. They were curated, and once those labels stuck, they shaped the industry's future more than any single film ever could. There was a moment, according to insiders, when Clint almost stopped talking entirely. He reportedly said he considered withdrawing from public conversations altogether, letting the work be the last word. But even that, he realized, would be interpreted as confirmation of whatever story others wanted to tell. Silence, he learned, isn't neutral in Hollywood. It's editable. When Clint finally spoke at 95, it wasn't to settle scores. It was to reclaim authorship of his own story before it ended without him in it. He admitted he waited because earlier would have turned it into spectacle. Now, he said, it could exist as context. Not drama, context. What stunned people most was Clint's final reflection on Rob Reiner. He said he didn't hate him. He didn't even resent him anymore. What lingered was disappointment, not in Rob as a person, but in how power changes people who believe they're immune to it. Clint said Rob became what he once pushed against, and by the time either of them realized it, the divide was already irreversible. As word of Clint's admission spread, Hollywood reacted in its usual way. Carefully, selectively, and with just enough distance to avoid commitment. Some quietly nodded. Others dismissed it as an old man's revision. But the damage, or perhaps the correction, was done. Because once Clint Eastwood finally told his truth, the old narrative stopped feeling complete. And the most unsettling part? This was only the beginning of what he admitted that night. Once Clint's admission began circulating, the industry didn't explode all at once. It cracked, quietly, unevenly, the kind of fracture you only notice once pressure has already done its work. Insiders say the second part of Clint's truth was harder to hear than the first, because it forced people to confront not just a personal rift, but a system many had benefited from while pretending it didn't exist. Clint reportedly explained that after a certain point, it stopped being about Rob Reiner specifically and started being about what Rob represented. A new kind of authority in Hollywood, not the studio head, not the producer, but the cultural gatekeeper. Clint said that once moral certainty became currency, disagreement became liability, and he found himself slowly repositioned from respected elder to symbolic obstacle. He described walking into rooms where the temperature changed instantly. Conversations would soften, then end. Projects he was attached to would suddenly shift direction. He wasn't blacklisted, he said, that would have been obvious, actionable. Instead, he was diluted. Moved to the margins without ever being told, he was no longer welcome at the center. What Clint finally admitted was that Rob wasn't alone in this, but Rob was early. Early in understanding how influence worked when paired with righteousness. Clint said Rob didn't need to attack him directly. He just needed to speak loudly enough, often enough, that others adjusted around the noise. And they did, eagerly. According to Clint, this created an unspoken hierarchy. There were artists whose politics were treated as evidence of depth, and others whose silence or dissent was treated as absence of conscience. Clint said he watched colleagues recalibrate in real time. Some distanced themselves from him privately while praising him publicly. Others stayed quiet entirely, hoping neutrality would keep them safe. One of the most revealing moments Clint shared was about a project he almost made, one that collapsed without explanation. He said he later learned, through back channels, that it wasn't the script or the budget that killed it. It was the optics. Someone didn't want to be seen aligning too closely with him, while Rob and others were shaping the narrative of what alignment meant. That realization, Clint admitted, hit harder than any public criticism ever could. He also spoke about how interviews became traps. Questions stopped being about craft and started being about compliance. Clint said he could feel when an answer would be clipped, reframed, and circulated without context. He learned to speak less, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he said was being pre-interpreted. That, he said, was the most exhausting part, performing for an audience that had already decided who you were. What made this section of his admission so unsettling was Clint's acknowledgement of his own role in allowing it to happen. He said he believed restraint was dignity. He believed avoiding public feuds was professionalism. But in hindsight, he realized that vacuum allowed others to define him. Rob, intentionally or not, benefited from that silence. And Clint lived with the consequences. He didn't accuse Rob of malice. In fact, Clint suggested something more uncomfortable, that Rob genuinely thought he was doing good. That belief, Clint said, can be more dangerous than open hostility. Because when someone believes they're morally correct, they stop questioning the impact of their actions. They stop noticing who gets pushed aside in the process. Clint also addressed the generational shift that deepened the divide. He said younger creatives didn't grow up negotiating disagreement face to face. They learned through signals, endorsements, and exclusions. Watching Rob's rise as a vocal cultural figure taught them what was rewarded. And Clint, by contrast, became an example of what happened when you didn't play along. There was a particularly heavy moment when Clint admitted he started seeing his own legacy being filtered through someone else's lens. He said films he made decades earlier were suddenly being reinterpreted through modern political framing, often with Rob's public commentary hovering nearby. Intent was ignored, context erased. What mattered was how the work could be used to support a present-day narrative. That, Clint said, was when he realized the conflict wasn't personal anymore. It was historical. Rob Reiner had become part of the mechanism, deciding how the past should be judged, who deserved nuance and who didn't. And Clint found himself on the wrong side of that recalibration. Insiders say Clint paused for a long time before addressing Rob directly in this part of the conversation. When he did, his voice reportedly softened. He said he wished Rob had spoken to him instead of about him. That one sentence carried decades of distance. Clint admitted he never received a direct confrontation, never a private conversation to clear the air. Everything happened through implication, through media, through absence. As this part of Clint's admission leaked, reactions intensified. Filmmakers quietly acknowledged recognizing the pattern. Others pushed back, insisting Clint was overstating his influence. But even those defenses seemed careful, almost rehearsed. No one wanted to fully contradict a 95-year-old legend who had nothing left to gain. What lingered after this section wasn't outrage. It was discomfort. Because Clint wasn't exposing a feud. He was exposing a culture where silence is punished, alignment is rewarded, and power hides behind principles. And by placing Rob Reiner at the center of that realization, Clint forced Hollywood to look at a mirror it had spent years adjusting the lighting around. And just when people thought Clint had said enough, he leaned into the part of the truth that made everyone in the room uneasy. He said the story didn't end with him. It continued in the careers that never happened, the voices that learned to self-edit, and the fear of being framed rather than heard. That's when listeners realized the final part of Clint's truth wouldn't just be about Rob Reiner at all. It would be about what happens next. By the time Clint reached the final stretch of what he admitted, the room had changed. Insiders say it no longer felt like a revelation unfolding, but a reckoning settling in. Clint wasn't naming enemies anymore. He was tracing consequences. And that's where the truth about Rob Reiner became impossible to dismiss as just a clash of personalities. Clint reportedly said the most dangerous part of that era wasn't the criticism or the exclusion. It was how normal it became. How quickly people adapted to a version of Hollywood where approval flowed from a narrow set of voices, and dissent didn't need to be punished loudly to be effective. He said Rob Reiner didn't invent that environment, but he normalized it by thriving within it and never questioning who was being squeezed out along the way. What Clint finally admitted was that he watched people change around Rob. Not overnight, but subtly. He saw colleagues become more performative, more cautious, more strategic with their beliefs. He said conversations that once revolved around story and character slowly morphed into conversations about optics and positioning. And once that shift happened, authenticity became risky. Clint acknowledged something that stunned even those closest to him. There were moments he considered speaking out directly against Rob. He considered confronting the narrative head-on, correcting assumptions, calling out what he felt was misrepresentation. But each time, he stopped himself. Not out of fear, but calculation. He said he understood the machinery well enough to know that any response would be framed as defensiveness, proof rather than rebuttal. That restraint, Clint admitted, cost him more than he realized at the time. It cost him allies who mistook silence for concession. It cost him the ability to shape how his values were understood. And eventually, it cost him control over how his career was remembered by people who never actually listened to him. One of the most striking moments came when Clint reflected on Rob Reiner's public persona. He said Rob became so comfortable speaking for others that he may have forgotten how rarely he listened to them. Clint wasn't accusing Rob of cruelty. He was accusing him of certainty. And certainty, Clint said, is the fastest way to stop seeing the human beings affected by your influence. Clint described a moment late in his career when a younger filmmaker approached him privately. The filmmaker thanked him for his work, then hesitated, then admitted he'd been warned not to say so publicly. Clint said that was the moment he realized the damage had outlived the disagreement. It had become institutional. Rob Reiner wasn't the only voice shaping that fear, but his prominence made it acceptable. As Clint spoke, he reportedly became reflective rather than bitter. He said he didn't believe Rob woke up intending to marginalize anyone. He believed Rob genuinely thought he was protecting something. But Clint questioned whether protection that requires silencing others is protection at all. That line, according to those present, hung in the air longer than anything else he said. He also addressed the public assumption that he and Rob were enemies. Clint said that framing was convenient because it reduced everything to personalities. Heroes and villains, left and right. What it obscured was the reality that both men were products of an industry that rewards loud certainty and punishes quiet complexity. Clint said he chose complexity. Rob chose certainty. And Hollywood chose certainty too. What made this final section so powerful was Clint's refusal to ask for vindication. He didn't say he was right and Rob was wrong. He said something far more unsettling. That the system rewarded Rob's approach and penalized his own. And that anyone watching learned from that outcome, whether they wanted to or not. Clint admitted he worried about what that lesson would mean long after he was gone. He worried about a Hollywood where fewer people take creative risks because they're too busy managing perception, where disagreement is interpreted as danger rather than dialogue, where legacy is filtered through ideology instead of craft. When Clint finally addressed Rob directly in his admission, it wasn't with anger. It was with finality. He said he wished Rob had understood that influence carries responsibility beyond applause. That shaping culture also means shaping consequences. And that silence from those affected doesn't mean consent. Sometimes it means exhaustion. Insiders say Clint ended by acknowledging that time had softened his need to be understood, but sharpened his need to be honest. At 95, he said, there was no upside to pretending anymore. He wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was trying to complete it. As news of this final section spread, the reactions shifted again. Some defended Rob Reiner more aggressively, framing Clint's words as outdated grievance. Others quietly reconsidered moments they'd previously dismissed. Old interviews resurfaced. Old quotes were re-examined. People began noticing how often Rob spoke about others and how rarely those others were invited to respond. Hollywood didn't issue a statement. It never does when the truth is inconvenient, but something changed. Conversations became quieter, more careful, less performative, because Clint hadn't just admitted something about Rob Reiner. He'd admitted something about the industry's moral shortcuts and who they leave behind. The final twist wasn't a scandal or an accusation. It was the realization that Clint Eastwood waited until the very end, not because he was afraid, but because he knew the truth would land harder when it could no longer be dismissed as ambition or rivalry. And the most haunting part of all, Clint reportedly said this wasn't a warning for Rob. It was a warning for everyone who comes after. Because when influence replaces dialogue and certainty replaces curiosity, the cost isn't paid by the loudest voices. It's paid by the ones who quietly disappear. And with that, Clint Eastwood didn't just admit the truth about Rob Reiner. He closed a chapter Hollywood had been hoping would end on its own. If you're still here right now, it's because you felt it too, that quiet, unsettling weight that settles in when a story isn't about scandal, but about power, silence, and what gets erased over time. This isn't the kind of moment you just watch and move on from. This is one of those rare moments where Hollywood's curtain slips just enough to show how influence really works behind the scenes. So don't let this disappear. Hit the like button if you believe stories like this deserve to be seen, not buried. That one click tells the algorithm this conversation matters, and it keeps voices like Clint's from being quietly pushed aside again. Drop a comment with your honest reaction. Not just who you agree with, but what this made you rethink about Hollywood, influence, and who gets to control the narrative. The comment section is where the real discussion happens, and some of the sharpest truths come from viewers who notice what others overlook. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Turn notifications on. Because stories like this don't end cleanly, they echo. More reactions surface. More people speak up. More forgotten moments suddenly make sense. And when that happens, you'll want to be here when the next piece drops, not catching up after the conversation has already moved on. Share this with someone who still thinks Hollywood disagreements are just politics or personal beef. This wasn't about that. It was about what happens when silence becomes survival. Stay connected, stay curious, stay uncomfortable. Because the truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it waits until the very end to finally be heard.